Thanks again for joining us this evening. My name is Holly Snyder. I'm with the Santa Barbara Public Library, and I am very excited tonight to have Nicka Smith share her story in finding John Lee. It's going to be a really fascinating story, and I can't wait. This is the last Book to Action series event, and I hope you were able to catch some of our other presentations. And this is a great way to end our fantastic series. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce Nicka Smith to you. Nicka Smith is a professional photographer, speaker, host, consultant, documentarian with more than 20 years of experience as a genealogist. She has extensive experience in African ancestor genealogy and reverse genealogy, and is expert in genealogical research in the Northeastern Louisiana area and researching enslaved communities. Nicka has diverse and varied experience in media with a background in audio, video, and written communications. She has appeared on the Today Show, CNN, MSNBC, on the series Who Do You Think You Are? And has been interviewed by Oakland Tribune, The Undefeated, National Geographic, and Time. She is the host of Black Pro Gen Live, an innovative web show with more than 125 episodes focused on people of color, genealogy, and family history.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm so excited you're going to take time out of your Monday, because Mondays are sometimes the pits for people, to join for this session about, especially around Louisiana ancestored genealogy. Louisiana is my favorite place to research, still is my favorite place in the entire world. And I've been quite a few places. So I love Louisiana. I love researching Louisiana, and especially to follow along with the Book to Action theming around, the Yellow House and what that experience is like, especially for those of us that descend from the formerly enslaved and that whole structure in the state of Louisiana. I hope that you will pick up something this evening that will help you along with your research efforts, give you the clues and tips and tricks and things that you need, to move forward, especially if you're at a standstill and you're not exactly sure what to do in order to get more information. I love interaction, so definitely use the chat and the Q&A section as I'm talking about things. I love that as well. I just want to say thank you to the Santa Barbara Public Library for having me. I have kind of old ties to Santa Barbara. I used to spend at least a week there during the summertime when I was in high school, because I'm from Southern California, going to cheer camp at UC Santa Barbara. So I remember being there quite a bit. So, all right, let's get into the subject matter at hand for this evening. All right, so we're going to be talking about John Lee. And one of the things I always like to remind people of is that those of us who have been at genealogy for a very long time, we had to start somewhere. Some of us had, branches of our family where someone had been doing the research for a long time. And then there are other branches of our family where no one knows absolutely anything. Like it's just a kind of I don't know. It's like people just kind of blew into town one day. And this story in particular about John Lee is one of those stories where we had absolutely nothing about him, just his name, no other information that we could, build upon or that we could expound upon in terms of just trying to learn more. And so when you have scenarios like that, you have to start with what you do know. And so let's start with what I did have. So you're looking at a picture of my grandmother. This is my mother's mother. Happy belated Mother's Day to everyone who is watching. And my grandmother was named Annie Ruth Atlas. Yes, that is our family surname, Atlas, like the world, or like the map. And my grandmother was born August 27th, 1916 in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana. And if you don't know where East Carroll Parish is, it is in the top northeastern portion of the state of Louisiana. Literally go all the way up the boot, and literally Arkansas is directly north, Mississippi is directly east. And my grandmother lived to be almost 100 years old. And I was lucky to see her every year of my life, despite the fact that I was born and raised in California, but my grandmother spent a large chunk of her life in Chicago. Of course, that is as a result of the Great Migration. My grandmother was one of 11 siblings, and out of her 11 siblings, 7 of them lived to be over age 90. And out of those, 11 children, 9 who reached adulthood, only 2 of them stayed in the state of Louisiana. The rest of them, as a result of the military, school, opportunity, they all left the state of Louisiana. So that means that me and my cousins, second cousins and beyond, are all spread out all over the country as a result of that. And so my grandmother died right there in Southern California, just almost to the day 5 years ago. And so her parents are Susie Lee, who was born in March of 1877 in East Carroll Parish as well. And she died in 1938. So my own mother never met her grandmother. There are very few of my mother's first cousins and people in the family who knew my great grandmother. There were some of the older cousins who remembered her funeral and things about that, maybe what she looked like, but they didn't really have a whole lot of detail around her father in particular, which is John Lee. And they knew more about her mother because her mother was around. My great-grandfather was named Louis Balfour Atlas, and he was born in 1874 also, but in Carroll Parish. And of course, when you're doing genealogy, you've got to be cognizant of when the counties or in the parishes, we're talking Louisiana, so we're talking parish instead of county, that's the term we use, when the parishes were formed. And so when Grandpa Babe was born in 1874, Carroll Parish was one parish. And then, around literally within days of Grandma Susie's birth in 1877, just a few years later, Carroll Parish was split into East and West Carroll parishes, which you see now. So always be aware of the parent counties or parishes, along with when boundary lines change, because sometimes when you're doing research, you may not be able to find people because they're not where you think they are, and the boundary lines and whatnot change. And so Grandpa Babe actually lived 20 more years longer than Grandma Susie did. So my mom and her first cousins, my uncle and all those people, my mom was one of 25 first cousins on just this side of our family. They all grew up knowing their grandfather. They didn't know their grandmother. So of course, John Lee, who's connected to Susie Lee, that's his daughter, they just didn't know very much. So with my grandmother, you start with, again, what you know, right? So I knew her, grew up with her, knew her details, but I also started to search out more stuff. So I had her birth certificate. I had her on the 1920, 1930, and 1940 census. I accessed that through Ancestry, or you can access that through Family Search. I also had oral history directly from her, as well as other family members. And I also have my grandmother's death certificate. And right, you're probably wondering, why would you gather these things on someone you know? Well, here's the thing. There could be what I call breadcrumbs on some of the documents that for people that that you're not thinking about, right? Like you're like, I already know where she was born, I already know where she died. But the thing is, the informant on a death certificate, the witnesses on a marriage, the people who sign, as a witness for different transactions, those folks can help inform and get you back further. So don't always think just because you know information or facts off the top that you don't have to go and find the additional documentation. And there's a comment in the chat. It says, maybe I can share some info about which states your grandparents immigrated from. So yeah, so my grandmother, literally 3 of my 4 grandparents are from the state of Louisiana. So this is where I spend most of my time research-wise, is Louisiana. The one grandparent that was not from the state of Louisiana was from Oklahoma. And just 12 years prior to her birth, that state was not in existence. Where she was born was technically the Cherokee Nation or the Indian Territory. So that's also another story that is available to us. Especially those people who were living in Southern California. There are a bunch of freedmen of the 5 tribes, being the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole, who live in Southern California. And it's kind of a second location. So that's where my grandparents are from. All right, so let's take a look at the census. This is 1920, and this is in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, the 3rd ward. It was taken on April 14th and 15th of 1920. If those of you who are super into genealogy will know that we are less than a year out from getting access to the 1950 census, because the 1950 census, the census has a 72-year hold on it. And so next year, we're going to get 1950. Up to now, we just have to 1940. So we're going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can see what's going on in this household. And there is the household of Louis or Louis and Susie Atlas, who are my great-grandparents. And highlighted in green is my grandmother at 3 years old. And she's in the household with all the rest of the slew of the children, including my great uncle, granduncle King, who was the oldest, and my grandmother was the youngest. So there was literally 22 years between the oldest child and the youngest child in this family. I just can't imagine being pregnant for 20 years, but God bless my great grandmother because she did it. All right. So beyond my grandmother, here's a photo of her mother. This is what Susie Lee looks like. This is Grandma Susie. Went over her details a little bit earlier. And when it comes to her parents, we knew way more about her mother than we did her father. Grandma Clara was well known in our family. In fact, there are several generations of descendants from her who have her name or variation of her name. And sort of the same thing with Grandma Susie. We also have that as well. Susie, Susan, Suzanne. If you know anything about researching families, a lot of names passed down, and that also could be one clue to researching your family history. And so Grandma Clara was born about 1850, and she died in 1928. And she actually died as a result of being hit by a car. She was the first pedestrian fatality in East Carroll Parish, when it came to cars, when cars became a thing. Grandma Clara was a midwife. That was her trade. She had to have picked this up during enslavement. And I was able to trace her slaveholder and her mother and her grandparents back as a result of just knowing more information about her. And what happened was she was coming from delivering a baby, and a car had driven by, and she thought she had waited for the dust to settle enough, but she didn't. She started to cross the road, another car came and hit her, and then she ended up passing away. And the thing about Grandma Clara was that she delivered the majority of the people in my family up until the day she died. So when you start finding death certificates or birth certificates, actually, you will see her name on those things. But for John Lee, we knew nothing, absolutely nothing other than just his name. And of course, John Lee is very much so like John Smith, where, there are millions of people around the country who have that name. So of course, when I started doing searches on the census and other things, I would find folks, but I wouldn't know if they were him, because part of the problem was I wasn't finding anybody in East Carroll Parish who was matching what I thought his description would be. I figured he would be around the same age as Grandma Clara, he'd be living maybe in the same ward, census ward, or, police jury ward. That's the designation we have that separates the parish, right? In Mississippi, you have beats. In Louisiana, you have police jury wards. In California, you have, your supervisors who sit on your board of supervisors who supervise your area. And so I wasn't finding anybody on the census with his information. I did have information for Grandma Susie, so I was able to track her. So I had her on the census in 1880. I had her censuses as well as in various years from 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. I had her marriage license to Grandpa Babe or Louis Atlas. I had oral history, of course, from my grandmother and her siblings, as well as, some of the first cousins from my mom and other family members. I had a Civil War pension affidavit because her uncle was in the Civil War and she served as a witness for her aunt to get his pension after he died. And so that meant that I literally had a sort of testimony from my great grandmother in her own words about her family history. And not only did she have one, but Grandma Clara had one too. But there was nothing in there about John Lee at all. So beyond that, I also had her death certificate. And this is Grandma Susie's death certificate. And if you do research in Louisiana, we do have access to Louisiana Death Index on Ancestry as well as on Family Search. The Family Search version of the Louisiana Death Index is a little bit better because it extracts the information that's most pertinent to us, right? And an index is not the actual certificate. It's just, the name, the date of death, the location, right? You'll definitely get that. But on the Family Search version, you're going to get details like parents' names if they're mentioned. You're also going to get maybe a cemetery if that's a field that they've indexed. But in Louisiana, we can't get certificates unless you're at a family search center, which hopefully when those open back up again, we will have access to those where you go in, you look, you can pull the index record, you'll get to the actual certificate. But beyond that, you'd have to write to the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge. And I think the fee is $5 per certificate. This copy of the certificate I got when I actually went to the state archives to go and do research. So it's a copy. When you're there and you're doing research at the Louisiana State Archives, the copies are not $5 a page, they're 50 cents. So they're marked up 10 times when you don't go there. So for Grandma Susie, again, her death certificate, I mean, considering that I've looked at so many of these, it's filled out actually quite a lot. Some of them I found have been bare bones information. I mean, that could be for a lot of different reasons, but Grandma Susie's was fairly consistent. And note, John Lee's name is on there, right? The irony is that the informant or the person who provided the information is my great-grandfather, is my great-grandmother's husband. They claimed he didn't know who her mother was or who his mother-in-law was. That's not true. He knew who she was. So again, when you're looking at these documents, you've got to ask questions as to why would they write don't know. Sometimes this is what we see, maybe some sort of institutional things and the location, right? Considering the relations between people of different income levels, maybe even racially. Sometimes those things affect how people are documented when we're looking at stuff now. So don't just entirely take everything literally. Sometimes you need to read into what was said by what was said and what was not said by what was said. All right, moving forward, Grandma Clara. Here she is in all her splendor. My mother looks so much like her. She was born about 1850 in Carroll Parish, Louisiana. Again, she died when crossing that road. She was hit by a car on accident. Her parents were Margaret Russell, who was born about 1835 and died before 1865. And more likely, the thing is, I've never seen Grandma Clara living with her mother, but it's sad because it was in the in-between time. It more likely was that she had probably passed away before the 1870 census, so we wouldn't have her documented. Moses Evans was Grandma Clara's father, but here's the caveat with that. We don't know anything about him. So DNA is having to take the lead for us on that because we're talking about enslaved people. And researching enslaved people, the process is different. It sometimes is extremely challenging or may seem like you can't find a lot of information. And we're going to talk about researching enslaved people a lot today. But it's not a place where you just completely give up hope, thinking that there are no records, there is no documentation. In fact, that is definitely not the case because money was involved. So that means that there is a paper trail. And sometimes you have to kind of go around the house 3 or 4 times to find what you're trying to get to. Now, Grandma Clara had her on the census, all kinds of stuff. And you're probably wondering, why are you walking out all this stuff for the women trying to get to the men? Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes the person that you're trying to find information for, when you try to go and search for them directly, you don't always find everything that you're looking for, or even a clue at all. And by researching the other people who were involved with that person, you might actually find more information on them or leads getting back to them. So here's my grandmother's birth certificate. And something that I often have to tell people about, especially when they're new to genealogy research, is that birth certificates are a 20th century invention for the most part. Unless you lived in a major metropolitan area, and since we're talking about Louisiana, unless you lived in New Orleans in particular, most folks are not going to have birth certificates until the early 1920s. Right? Some areas may have had adherence to the state law requiring birth certificates earlier than that, but for the most part, do not expect to have a birth certificate for folks born in Louisiana until the 1920s and after. I even have cousins who were born in the 70s who were born as a result of being delivered by a midwife who don't have a birth certificate issued at birth. They have delayed birth certificates. So keep that in mind. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that my grandmother actually had one. And it seems like she's the only one out of all of her 11 siblings that had it. But notice there's her name, Annie R. Atlas. There's her mother, Susie Lee. And notice who the person was who was the attending physician or midwife, Clara Atlas, who is my grandmother's grandmother, who is my great-great-grandmother, and who was the partner or whatever, because we don't know at this point, of John Lee. So at this point, I had exhausted all of my possibilities when it comes to researching this man, right? I looked online, I went through vital records, I'd exhausted everything I possibly could. So my next option was to go to the location. If you've never been to where you're researching, of course, pandemic barring, I highly suggest that you do that because, again, don't ever think that every single record that exists in Louisiana or even elsewhere is online and is digitized. I can tell you emphatically, after doing this for more than 20 years, that is so not the case, and don't ever subscribe to that. No matter what someone tells you, there are scores of records that are within the courthouse, within the clerk's office. Luckily in Louisiana, we have more. We have one clerk versus 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, right? Where we just go to that office, they maintain marriage records, conveyances, that's our fancy word in Louisiana for deeds. They have court records, they've got probates, all of that is in one office. And the majority of that stuff is not digitized and it is not available from home. You can only get it if you go there. So here's an example of a document that I found when I went to Lake Providence or to East Carroll Parish, Louisiana. And it is the equivalent of a labor contract. You're going to hear this term used quite often in the next few months because of collections that are getting ready to be released by Ancestry, in particular the Freedmen's Bureau. We could talk about that for 3, 4, 5 hours a week, because that's such an incredible collection that documents formerly enslaved people in the American South or areas that were practicing enslavement or slaveholding, and it documents them for the first time usually, and it's before the 1870 census. And so labor contracts really were establishing working relationships between the formerly enslaved and landowners. And sometimes those landowners were the former enslavers of the folks who were newly emancipated, or they were just land speculators or folks that came down from the North after the war, because there was a ton of abandoned property that was all across the South because slaveholders were like, look, the Union troops are here or they're coming. I don't want them coming to get my stuff. And so as a result of that, they would flee into other places. In particular, a lot of folks in Louisiana left and went to Texas. So if you have ties, maybe you found an ancestor on the 1870 census and they're born in Texas or born in Louisiana and they're in Texas, and maybe because their slaveholder took them out of the state of Louisiana into Texas. So with this example, with this labor contract, it notes Chloe Evans, which a lot of times Grandma Clara is referred to as Chloe instead of Clara, and Emmeline Lee to warrant William Alling. This is at Black Bayou Plantation, January 31st, 1875. We, the undersigned, meaning Clara and Emmeline, hereby waive all rights to any portion of the crop of John Lee as hirelings, meaning they are working under John Lee. And because they are working under John Lee and there's a debt that he has to William Alling, they are waiving their right to be paid in order that they may put their money or their earnings towards John paying off this debt to William Alling. So here I had a tie between a John Lee, Grandma Clara, right? A plantation. It's in 1875. It's within 10 years of them, being emancipated from slavery, right? The other pieces in Louisiana were lucky. Not only do we have conveyance books, which are deeds, right, conveying property from one person to another, which in some instances can include enslaved people, but we also have mortgage books, which are separate, and those are not digitized or microfilmed anywhere. You have to get them at the county or the parish courthouse. So these labor contracts in East Carroll Parish are in the mortgage books, and I can pretty much guarantee you when you go to other parishes, you're going to find something similar. So here, this was great. I had at least one piece of paper beyond, and one piece of evidence beyond just the oral history about John Lee. That was great, right? So I found another one. Here's another labor contract 1876, it's the year later, right? And it mentions it's still the same William Allen, still the same plantation, Black Bayou Plantation. And it talks about him leasing the land from a man named William Allen, and that he's able to cultivate a crop, and that in exchange for doing so, that Allen is gonna give him a certain amount of credit towards things that he can use to cultivate his crop, whether it's a mule or wagon or whatever that stuff is, and that he's supposed to deliver a certain amount of cotton to William Allen at the end of the term. So up until DNA comes to the scene, this was all I had for John Lee. That was it. I didn't have anything else. And this is where DNA came to the rescue for me, because again, I had searched all the stuff online. I had even gone to where my family was from. I even traced the slaveholder for Grandma Clara, but I didn't have anything for John Lee. And DNA literally came in with like a superhero's cape in, because it literally broke this entire thing wide open. And when I mean DNA, I'm talking about the tests that you see on television advertised, either through Ancestry, through 23andMe, that allow you to not only get the percentages of the DNA that you have from various regions across the world, but the most important part of the testing is the comparisons that you can do against the other folks who have tested. Meaning it looks at my DNA and it compares it to yours. And if we're related, it shows a degree of relatedness. This is where researching formerly enslaved people is literally being turned on its head, because before we were reliant on the paper trail, which could have been destroyed by fire, right? There were a ton of courthouses set on fire during the Civil War, even after. And if that paper trail is gone, how else can we find out if our ancestors were sold from one place to another, if families were broken apart? DNA is allowing us at least even a smidgen of a clue to get back to that information that could possibly have not been known. So, no lie, I was literally sitting in a hotel room in Burbank when I was at a conference. I was at the Southern California Genealogy Jamboree, which is coming up in a month or so. Be sure to register for that, because I am a speaker there too. And I was looking through my DNA matches, and I came across a match with someone we'll call Cousin B. And it was a decent match, right? In DNA, we use the term centimorgans, right? CM, that's what it means. And that's the degree of measurement, like an inch or, centimeter, which people think, when they see CM. But in this instance, it is a centimorgan. And Cousin B and I shared 50 centimorgans on 3 segments. So I said, okay, well, here's the thing. Let me pull open her tree. I want to see if I can figure out how me and her are related. So I looked at her tree and I noticed, okay, I'm scanning names, and you should be doing this continually if you've done DNA testing and you're trying to get more leads. You should be always kind of browsing your matches to see the whens, the wheres, the hows, the whys, and trying to figure out how folks are connected to you. And the thing that stood out to me was that Cousin B's father was named John Lee. Now, could it be the same person? Well, let's do time travel, right? The guy I'm looking for has to be born about 1850. And this cousin who's tested, her father is born in 1927. So obviously they're not the same person, because there's no way, unless he is time traveling from slavery era all the way until now, unless he's been cryogenically frozen, there is no way that this is the same guy. But they have the same name, and notice where he is born. He's born in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's no way. Wait, so how would I prove, right? If I have a DNA match that's a decent sized DNA match, how would I prove that this individual is connected to me on a side of the family that I have no information on? That's where I have to do my research, right? And sometimes your matches know a little bit more than you do, or their records are leaving you more clues than yours are. So you kind of go around the house and come through the front door, right? Instead of through the back, even though you parked at the back, sometimes you have to go around the house to get to the information. So I took a chance and I said, well, let me look at what she's got, right? You've got to vet the information the person has on their tree. You don't just want to trust things, right? You want to make sure that they've come to sound conclusions. So I looked at Edward Lee, who was the father of John Lee, right? This is cousin B, my DNA matches grandfather. And I found him on the census in 1880. And he's in the household with a Asbury Lee. And he's 39. And this Asbury Lee would be around the age of my John Lee. So then I'm like, well, is Asbury actually Grandma Susie's father, or is he her uncle? Because he's on the same generation as her dad. And is Edward a first cousin of Grandma Susie, or is he just a cousin? I've got to find more information. There's nothing conclusive. There's not a John Lee living next door to them, or as an informant on any death certificates or anything like that. So again, I had to continue the research process so that the DNA would meet up with the paper trail and tell me where I needed to go. So in the process of researching Asbury Lee, I found out that he was a U.S. Civil War veteran. And that is so important. Why? Because the estimates are that 1 in 4 people of African descent descend from at least one Civil War veteran that fought for the U.S. colored troops. That's a high statistic. And Asbury Lee, based on this pension card that I found on Ancestry, right? He was a soldier in the U.S. Colored Infantry, the 47th U.S. Colored Infantry in Company B. It lists his widow. And so I know around when he died. And here's the thing. I know when he died, not because I have a death certificate, because again, remember, that's mostly a 20th century invention, just like a birth certificate, but because of the date mentioned on the card. They wouldn't have a widow's pension issued, right? That line wouldn't even exist right here if he had not died. And that tells me he died around 1892. So because I found this card, if you ever come in contact with a card that's like this and you're pretty sure it's your individual that you're researching, there's a separate process that comes a part of this. You can submit a request to the National Archives. And right now, those are being held up because of the pandemic. But in usual times, you can submit a request to the National Archives using the application number and the certificate number to get a copy of the Civil War pension files of these individuals. If you recall earlier, I talked about having one of those for an uncle of my great-grandmother and how she had an affidavit in there talking about her relationship to him and validating that her aunt deserved to receive a widow's pension. So here goes another one for the same side of the family. So at this point, I sent off for this file and I waited to get it back. In the interim, I kept working the genealogy, right? And it became that we expanded this research out another generation, okay? So now we're at the point where, all right, Asbury, born around the same time as when I think my John Lee is born, but I still have to verify that cousin B is connected to me on my mother's side of the family. I have to do the work to figure out, you can't just assume because the names fit and the locations fit. You still have to do a little bit more digging in order for you to know if that relationship is truly on the side of the family that you need it to be. So again, if we go back to me and cousin B, her great tree, the fact that she tested, thank you for that, right? Now I've got to figure out what work do I need to do to confirm that she's related to me on my mother's side, because that's where I need her to be connected to me. Thankfully, cousin B and my mother, they tested on the various sites, right? So my mom's on Ancestry DNA, she's on 23andMe, cousin B's on Ancestry DNA and on 23andMe. But I also had the added benefit of my grandmother testing on 23andMe before she passed away. So that means that if I look at my DNA in comparison to cousin B, my mother's DNA in comparison to cousin B, and my grandmother's DNA in comparison to cousin B, in a perfect world, cousin B would be matching all of us. In fact, cousin B should be matching my grandmother more than she'd be matching my mom because of what's called recombination. Despite the fact that my grandmother, of course, birthed my mother and my mother birthed me, DNA is passed down by generation. And each time a new generation is introduced in a family and, two people come together and have a child, it's like shaking dice. And you don't always inherit every single piece of DNA from a particular ancestor that, from your parents. You don't. And even the only way that someone would be entirely an exact duplicate of someone genetically is if they're an identical twin, right? Even siblings that are full siblings do not share the exact same amount of DNA. from various parents. Even if you and your siblings share the exact same mom and dad, you may take more from your father and your sibling may take more from your mother. You're still full siblings, but you guys just took a little bit of a different iteration. So what happened? When I compared my DNA to cousin B, notice the difference in the amount of DNA shared on 23andMe, which is, this is a screenshot of the comparison on 23andMe versus Ancestry. Ancestry is more conservative in the amount of DNA that it says that you share, right? Just to err on the side of caution. You want to make, they want to make sure that you are definitely connected to a person, right? So sometimes the amount of DNA may be more, and you can see if it is. If you click on the amount of DNA shared, it'll pop up a box and it'll give you what's called the unweighted average, which may be more than what is shown initially. So based on 23andMe and the raw amount of DNA that me and cousin B share, it's actually higher. It's 72 centimorgans. When I compared my mother to cousin B, it was 79. So literally, it was 7 difference. But my grandmother was more than twice the amount. So I knew that cousin B connected to me on my grandmother's side of the family. So yes, that is great. I want her to compare. I want her to be there because, again, that's where John Lee is. John Lee is my grandmother's grandfather. Cousin B has to match him. So has to match her. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. But I was still not done because at this point, which side of my grandmother's family does cousin B fit on? You've got parents, you got a mother and a father. That means you've got 2 branches of your family. So just because cousin B shares with my mom, my grandmother and my mom, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's connected on my grandmother's mother's side, which is where I need her to be connected on. So I've got to rule out that she's not connected elsewhere. And this relationship, right, that could potentially be shared between all of us would be at the great grandparent level for my grandmother. Those individuals were all enslaved. So that means potentially that whoever John Lee's father is, if it's the same person as Asbury Lee's father or mother, those people were enslaved. They may not even have lived to see freedom. That's where we're doing the research. There may not even be a paper trail for those folks. This is something that you have to weigh. Look at the birth dates of these folks. 1810, 1835, right? It's a lot. So in order to rule out or rule in the side of the family that cousin B is connected, I had to do more work. And that meant that I had to use the DNA results of other family members who were connected to my grandmother through her mother and her father to see if cousin B was in common with them too. And if they were in common with her through her dad, I knew there was no way I could figure out or connect her to John Lee. But if they were connected to her through her mother, I knew that it had to be John Lee. And let me explain why. Here's a table. And in this table, you see my mom, who's a relation to my grandmother as her daughter. You see me, right? And the fact that we share DNA in the same exact spots with my grandmother, right? With cousin B. This is a process, it's a simplification of what the process of triangulation is, right? Think of a triangle, it's got 3 points. My grandmother's at the top, I'm, at the right angle, my mom is, at the left angle, right? Or cousin B is there. In between us, and that space in between is the commonality between all of us, okay? And you want to have that. You want to have the matches be triangulated, okay? So of course, because my grandmother passed DNA from, to my mom passed it to me, we all connect to cousin B. But I had to look at other family members. And my grandmother has a niece. She's got a few great nephews, another great niece, right? Who all also shared DNA with cousin B, which is great. But all of those people connect to my grandmother through her parents. So they're not so much useful in trying to figure out if it's one side or the other. I needed someone to be a generation further to confirm whether or not it was her mother or her father. I needed someone to be related to my grandmother through her grandparents on those respective sides to rule a side in or out. So we had at least 2 people who could confirm that relationship. And neither one of those folks shared DNA with cousin B. All right, well, wait a minute. So they didn't share. So then how do you still know that it's connected to the right side of the family? Well, let's look at this in action through the tree. If we go back to my grandmother's tree, right? Cousin CL represents the relationship that my grandmother has to her father's parents, to her paternal grandparents, right? The large group of folks who, who have tested with the initials JDT, CTB, DDT, all those folks, right, that are here. They all represent the relationship that my grandmother has to her maternal grandfather, right? They also represent the relationship that my grandmother has to her maternal grandfather, or grandmother. But there's one person in particular that just represents the grandmother. Why? Grandma Clara had 3 sets of children. And because she had 3 sets of children, that means that her descendants, any of those descendants that connect to each other, have to be connected through a half relationship, right? My great-grandmother was the only child of John Lee and Grandma Clara. MGR, who is represented here, comes from Grandma Clara and another relationship. So anyone that my grandmother has in common with MGR is, in terms of a DNA match, is only connected through Grandma Clara, not through John Lee. So when I did the comparison, CL shared no DNA. So now at this point, that means, all right, I've got to see if MGR shares with cousin B. She didn't share any DNA with them. So now, great, this is exactly what I need. That means cousin B connects through John Lee. So now I've got to establish where that comes from, because we don't know names, dates, we don't know anything. So this is where it gets really interesting, because once that pension file came back, that answered pretty much all of my questions. And I just want to talk about something just very quickly when it comes to looking at your DNA matches, because I was able to make this inference so much more quickly and easily because cousin B had such a great tree. And sometimes in this scenario, especially with DNA matches, you are going to have to do the work for your cousins. They may not have the skill set to do the research like you do, or know where to look for records, or know where to go to get answers. And you may have to build the tree out for them. And a lot of us get irritated when we're looking at our matches and we see that they don't have trees and they're the highest person on your list. Well, maybe that's a call to you to help them do the research, right? So again, her tree was great, okay? She had sourced, look at her records are sourced, right? She's got dates, she's got locations, she's got all that stuff in there. If you go to John Lee's profile, it's not just a bunch of sources that say ancestry, family tree. No, it's literally census records and marriage records and the Social Security death index. This is the kind of stuff that you want to see when you're looking at your DNA matches trees, or when you build their trees out so that you can make sound conclusions, right? So we're going back here, right? Asbury, this pension file, okay? Of course, it's not overnight. They don't do digital delivery unless they've changed some things. I'm pretty sure they don't. So I'm waiting for the mail for this file to come back. And again, remember, I'm working with this card, right? I know which infantry he's in, the company. I know when he applied for his pension, right, due to disability, it was in 1883. I know that it was issued, right? If you don't see a number in the certificate area, that lets you know that the person applied because there's an application number. But if there's no number here, it means that they weren't given the pension. If there is a number here, that means that they were. Regardless, if you find one of these cards, order the pension, because even if a person was denied, there's still incredible genealogical information in that file. Again, we know Asbury died about 1892. So let's talk about the U.S. Colored Infantry, the 47th Infantry. They were organized March 11th, 1864, and they were mustered out January 5th, 1866. Again, this is the Civil War. This is a Black regiment. Key locations. They were in Vicksburg, which was in Warren County, Mississippi. It's just across the Mississippi River from Lake Providence, Louisiana. They also were in, drumroll, Lake Providence, right? So I knew I had the right Asbury. Noted battles, they were a part of the siege at Fort Blakely. And that was the final major battle of the Civil War. It happened within hours of the surrender of Appomattox Courthouse that we all know about with the picture and Lee and Grant and all that stuff. Literally, it was one of the last battles. There were 432 deaths that this infantry suffered, right? 1 officer, 30 enlisted men that were killed or wounded. Note that 3 officers and 398 men died due to disease. They weren't even shot. Most people think, oh, well, the folks that died in the Civil War was all because of gunfire. No, more people died due to disease than actual gunfire. Then, of course, in addition to the pension card, you pull the muster cards or the service cards. You can get these on Ancestry. You can get these on Fold3. You don't have to, write to the National Archives for these. And what these muster cards are, and this is what it is on the left-hand side, is they give you the description of the individual. So we see that Asbury was 5 feet 7.5 inches tall, which is hilarious because that's how tall I am. He was 23 years old. His complexion is yellow, and his eyes are black and his hair is black. That's kind of a strange description, but hey, we're going to go with it. It mentions that he was born in Carroll Parish, Louisiana, and he's a laborer, and it talks about when he mustered in, which technically was earlier. He was part of a Corps d'Afrique, right? That means that's a state created regiment that was eventually enlisted into the federal government or the Union troops. A lot of U.S. colored troop regiments were mustered in at the state level and then brought in later. And it talks about him being mustered in Lake Providence, Louisiana. So when I got his file, I figured out he had more than one wife. The one you see him with on the 1880 census we saw earlier was a second wife. He had children. Notice his son, Edward, who was Cousin B's grandfather, along with another child named John. Now we know this John can't be my John because there's no way that Asbury would have been old enough to have birthed a child, right, at the approximate age of my John Lee. But the fact that he had a child named John, that is more signaling to me that he's probably my John Lee's brother. Beyond that, they mention his former slaveholder. So this isn't a exercise of us running around like a chicken with our head cut off trying to find this information. In fact, one of the easiest ways to track down a slaveholder is to get a pension file like this, because those folks have to prove that they lived at a certain place, that the people know them. And a lot of times the folks that are doing the depositions for them to, verify that they are in fact the veteran are folks who were formerly enslaved with them, or sometimes the slaveholder, the former slaveholder, is a witness in a pension file. They mentioned James Kerr and that he lived in Carroll and Claiborne parishes. So this is telling me, wait a minute, there's another parish to look at, because I'm just looking at East Carroll Parish. I'm not looking at Claiborne Parish. I haven't been told to do that. All of my paper trail has said East Carroll. Nothing has said Claiborne. Why would I even look there? But the pension file told me to, right? So here is literally a copy of the affidavit or deposition of Asbury Lee from August 2nd, 1886. And he mentions the first year after I was discharged, I worked for Ed H. Davis farming as a field hand and received the current wages for farm laborers. But Dr. Lewis, first name unknown, gave me some eye water to wash my eyes. Asbury was claiming for a pension because he was having eye issues, and eventually he went blind. Put a pin in that because that's going to come back later. The next year, I worked for the same Dr. Lewis who rented the same land I worked on for Davis. The land belonged to James D. Kerr, the man I belonged to before the war. Dr. Lewis died that year. The third year after I was discharged, I went on Mr. Allen. Remember that initial labor contract, those little 2 pieces of paper that I found at the courthouse, right? That talked about Emmeline Lee and Clara Evans being hirelings of John Lee, and they're working for William Allen at Black Bayou Plantation. And then there was the second one, which is John Lee and William Allen. Wait a minute, here are all these clues coming in, right? This is why you got to pay attention to the breadcrumbs that are left behind. He continues, right? Third year after I was discharged, I went on Mr. Allen's place on Black Bayou. Another clue, okay, with my father and brothers, and have remained there ever since. I worked with my brothers for my father until he died 6 years ago. So now I have a date for the dad, and the dad could be John's father, but I don't know his name. So then it says, since then I have leased from Mr. Allen. My children works the land, and Mr. Allen advances to us until the crop is made, when Mr. Allen sells cotton and makes a settlement according to his own accounts. Oh my gosh. So I'm thinking, okay, he's talking Reconstruction, all of this. Let me go see if I can find a labor contract with the Freedmen's Bureau to see if there's something between Asbury Lee, his father who was unnamed, and his brothers who were unnamed on Black Bayou in East Carroll or Carroll Parish at the time. Oh, look. There is J.E. Lewis and Company. That would be the doctor. April 10th, 1867. Number 1 listed on this list is a man named Armstead Lee, who is 50 years of age. And right underneath him is a man named Asbury Lee, along with an Albert Lee and a David Lee. Right there, they're listed as first-class workers. Their interest in profits is 1/3. Notice it mentions that Armstead is responsible for, he has one dependent along with Asbury having one dependent, the rate of wages that they're getting, right? And again, this contract is issued by the same person Asbury mentioned in his deposition. So now I'm like, oh my gosh, is Armstead his father? Is Armstead John's father and Asbury's father? This pretty much sounds like it, okay? Go back to the deposition. He belonged to James D. Kerr, right, before the war. Well, who is James Kerr? And what's up with that, right? So I know that James Kerr is involved. He's the slaveholder, right? We've got Asbury saying this directly. Here's an excerpt from one of the write-ups that one of the pension examiner, William Warren White, wrote up about James Kerr. He says, finding upon inquiry here, the claimant was at Homer. Homer is different from Homa. Homa is down in southern Louisiana, right? That's Terrebonne Parish, but Homer is in Claiborne Parish. He notes that claimant, being Asbury Lee, was at Homer a short time after months before he and his brother Lemus. Here goes another brother. We saw David, we saw Albert. Who is Lemus? We don't know who that is, but him and Lemus, Asbury Lemus, ran away and went into the army, and that James Kerr, Asbury's former owner, is dead, and that James Kerr's son, Walter, is now living at, drumroll, Black Bayou, or some 10 miles from Lake Providence, East Carroll Parish, Louisiana. I see no necessity of going to Homer, as Asbury was not known there. So basically what this just told me is that James Kerr left East Carroll Parish and went to Carroll Parish during the war. Well, I know that James Kerr died after slavery ended, so let me see if I can find him in 1870. And if I find him in 1870, is John Lee living anywhere around him? Well, let's see what happened when I did that. Would you look at that? On the 1870 census in Claiborne Parish, Louisiana, on the bottom level in yellow, you will see J.D. Kerr, who is the former slaveholder of John Lee, Asbury Lee, and Armstead Lee. And literally 2 or 3 households away is John Lee. The reason why I didn't find my great-great-grandfather is because I was looking in Carroll Parish. I did not know to look in Claiborne, which is, it's west. Why would I have gone to Claiborne? I had no reason. Sometimes people make these huge jumps and say, oh, well, that's got to be my person because it's nearby. What other proof do you have that that's the right person? I had proof. So that let me know that I had needed a reason, right, to go and look in this particular parish. But no, remember in the pension file, I mentioned that Asbury Lee had a son named John. Note that John Lee has a son named Asbury. The other piece is, remember the hireling who worked under John Lee? Well, who was there keeping house in 1870 but a woman named Emmeline? What happened was James D. Kerr left during the war. He took all of his enslaved people to Claiborne Parish. Some of them returned back to East Carroll Parish, including John Lee. But John Lee, it took my great-great-grandfather, it took him time to come back to East Carroll Parish. Even though Asbury left, ran away with his brother to go enlist in the Civil War. And so he ended up back there earlier on. Go back to the same deposition. I went on Mr. Alling's place, Black Bayou, with my father and brothers. Asbury talked about that after the war. Again, here's the labor contract that I first showed you. My only piece on John Lee, William Alling is mentioned in this piece, right? Same thing with John Lee and the labor contract that I found earlier with William Alling. All of those little breadcrumbs are coming back to haunt us over and over and over again. Now, here's another clue that I didn't really pay attention to until I had all of this context. If you look at the 1870 census, and I look at Grandma Clara, who was there in this top line in yellow as a 12-year-old child, on the same page is Armstead and Jemima Lee. Those are John Lee's parents. Those are Asbury's parents. They're on the same page. Now, I had seen them for years and I could make leaps and jumps and assume that they were the right people, but I've got to go through the correct steps of verifying that they are before I could just make a wild inference. Okay. So they were right there the whole time. I just did not know. So again, if we look at the relationship that Ancestry projects, and remember, with DNA, you've got to pay attention to the fact that you've got to look at how generations fall in families. Cousin B and my mother on the same generation. I'm on the generation with their children. And you also have to look at the fact that DNA has ranges. It's not exact. So it may give you a projection of fourth to sixth cousin, but it may be higher just based on how the DNA comparison is going, right? Relationships like grandparents and first cousins and stuff like that, even those share similar amounts of DNA. And so sometimes, again, if you know the relationship on paper, it's just an estimate, and it's because there's ranges that it shows up like this. So what's the true relationship between me and cousin B? We are third cousins once removed. Our common relations are Armstead Lee and Jemima Taylor. In fact, once I knew to look in Claiborne Parish, I actually found Armstead and Jemima's marriage certificate there. Again, I had no reason to look in Claiborne Parish because I didn't know my folks had ended up there. And they really was a temporary stop because their slaveholder took them out of East Carroll Parish, okay? So John Lee and Asbury Lee are brothers. That is what happened. So in order for me to get to this information, it took a lot. Asbury Lee had to abscond for more than 100 miles and evade capture as a fugitive slave to enlist in the US colored troops in order to leave me the paper trail behind to find him and connect him to John Lee. That is a lot, right? Go back to this statement where the pension examiner, William Warren White, says in 1890 that there was no reason for him to go to Homer, Louisiana, to look for any information on Asbury because he didn't live there very long, right? So let's talk about all the things that had to come together in order for me to get to this file, right? Before I even discovered that a file was a thing or that there was even an Asbury. Look at the fact that this man had to literally walk for 125 miles in order for him to enlist because he left that first place, Homer, to go to Lake Providence, okay? That's 40 hours of journeying. Beyond that, he had to evade being captured, either by the Confederates or by the Union troops for whatever reason, right? That's a long way, along with Lemus, to travel and to avoid being captured, right? Being made a prisoner of war, being made to do things you didn't want to do, right? Even being killed, because there was a lot of vigilante violence going on during the war. That is just crazy. He enlisted. He served in the Civil War, despite the fact that more than 500,000 other men died. So he had to live, he had to survive the war. And beyond that, he went blind. He was completely blind by the time he passed away. And they talk about that in his pension file. And he had to live long enough to be able to provide all the information in that proof that was in that file. That's a whole lot of ifs in order for me to get to this place, right? Now, in Louisiana, federal occupation started in 1862 in New Orleans when it was surrendered to the Union. Colonel C.T. Beauregard of the Confederate troops ordered for slaveholders and plantation owners to actually burn their cotton so that the Union troops could not get it and, profit off of it. And there's a Civil War diarist that was in Northeast Louisiana named Kate Stone. Her diary is called Broken Burn. If you have any connections to Northeast Louisiana, I highly suggest reading it. She mentions that her family alone burned $20,000 worth of cotton, which is the equivalent of $480,000 today, just to keep the Union troops from getting it, okay? Local histories talk about how there was a federal presence in Lake Providence, right? And they say the presence of federal troops in Providence prompted many area planners to send their Negroes and cotton to the Macon Hills to avoid capture. This talks about, of course, this is addressing James Kerr leaving East Carroll Parish because the federal troops were there. Ulysses S. Grant cut into the Lake Providence, because Lake Providence actually has a lake, and wanted a channel to hide gunboats for the Battle of Vicksburg. That's why there were federal troops there. The local area history, which is something you should definitely consider tapping into if you're doing slavery era research, especially, also notes many slaves looked upon the federal troops as liberators and ran away from their masters into federal camps. Tensions between master and slave, along with the growing threat of federal raids on the isolated plantations, forced more planters to desert their homes and flee inland to the Macon Hills and beyond. Some residents of Carroll and Madison even refugeed to Texas. So this is something that I talked about earlier. James Kerr, here he is in the 1860 US Census in Carroll Parish, Louisiana. Note, he is noted as a planter with $87,000 worth of real estate and $65,000 of personal estate. If you adjust that for inflation today, that means that his real estate will be worth more than $2.3 million. And his personal estate will be worth more than $1.7 million today. Included in that personal estate were Armstead and Jemima Lee, along with their children, Henry, Asbury, Lemus, David, Albert, and John Lee. Now to close, something else. Now, of course, Asbury had to abscond. He had to do all of these things, right? All of these factors had to fall into play. But something else that took place is that the man who was the special examiner over his case, he dropped dead while he was out on the field. And so he was I believe he was in Little Rock when that happened. And they noted in the paper, the remains of Captain Warren White, the special examiner of pensions, who died Thursday evening from malarial fever, were shipped last evening to Ballston Spa, New York for burial. So even he died. Thankfully, before he dropped dead, he wrote up his findings for me to be able to come to them 100, at least 100 plus years later, for me to connect my family. All right, let's get to your questions. Okay, so there was a question around slave censuses. Yes, now the slave schedules is probably what you're referring to, and that was taken in the federal census in 1850 and 1860, but enslaved people have been documented on the census since the census first started in 1790. It's just most people miss it because that first page is going to have all those totals and tallies, and there's a second page that enumerates enslaved people. Now, with the slave schedules, where the pivot was for that in 1850 and 1860 was that it did enumerate folks not based on categories like age 10 to 26 or whatever the random number is. It actually listed people, individuals, but that is not the litmus test for which you should verify that folks enslaved other people. Why? The slave schedules, for the most part, 99.9% of the time, does not list enslaved people by name. It is a blank line. And we have a senator from South Carolina to thank for the reason why enslaved people were not documented by name on that census. He himself was a slaveholder. I always bring him up because I want folks to know why and have someone to sort of, hold culpable for this. There was a whole argument on the Senate floor around whether they should burden the census enumerators with writing down the names of the formerly enslaved. And Senator Allen from South Carolina said that, well, there might be 2 or 3 people in the same plantation with the same name. And, how do you designate, between one Bob and the other Bob? And, he claimed that it was insignificant. And here we are years later, crawling and scratching and climbing to try and get this information when it could have been documented then, and it was not. So beyond a gender and a race and an age, there is no names for those people. So yes, you can use that as sort of a backup or ancillary evidence, but what you want to find is you want to find bills of sale, you want to find probates, you want to find Civil War pension files, you want to find Freedmen's Bureau records where they say the former slave, who the former slaveholder is. There's all kinds of different documents that do much more the purpose of verifying slave ownership than a blank line with an age, a gender, and a race. That's what you should always try to search for. And the unfortunate part about popular culture is a lot of stuff that we're seeing on television. If they'll say, Holly, there's your ancestor, and it's a blank line. And I'm like, why do we do that when we can show Holly the bill of sale or the will or the probate with the person's name on it? So yeah, that's right. That's backup. That's like, hey, we want to use the good china, and just in case you break the glass, we've got cups. You use it for that. Thank you for the feedback, anonymous attendee. They said, thank you for the excellent presentation and a very clear description of how to research that unknown ancestor. Yeah, that's the thing that I think, again, that people think that folks that present like me, we have it all figured out. We've got our whole tree research all the way back to Charlemagne. And, no, there are always going to be holes. There are always going to be scenarios that lend themselves to, you just can't, you haven't figured it out. And a lot of it sometimes is records access. Like, you know what I mean? That you can get to it and that it's in a format that you can mine through in order to find the information. That I say that's the biggest hurdle by itself, is just having access to stuff. And not so much because somebody's got it behind lock and key. It's just, it's in a format, it's on microfilm, it's, tucked behind some big box or something in a courthouse. I mean, there's so many different variables that factor in. There's a question, did you feel you were lucky that this stuff doesn't happen often? Yeah, I would say so, because, especially researching informally enslaved, you're really dependent on the people at the time documenting your folks, because those who were formerly enslaved, in most states, it was not legal for them to know how to read and write. So they were dependent on those who could to document them. And a lot of times that was as a result of financial connections, right? Some financial benefit was coming from the documentation of that person or was being conveyed. And so, barring that, or including that, I should say, you're also hoping that there's no courthouse fire, that, the whole courthouse or the documents didn't go up in flames. You know what I mean? There's a whole lot of things that can come into play with finding the information, but don't count yourself out at the beginning thinking it just isn't there. Like, you still have to try to go and find it. Oh, wow. Okay, great comment. Not a question, but it's appreciated how you brought that research alive and made it easy to understand. You inspire me to continue my own search. Oh, thank you. Very entertaining and informative. I'm glad. Thank you for that. Great presentation. Did you happen to find any family Bibles that helped you research? See, here's a cautionary tale. We had a family Bible. Sure did. Had a family homestead, land, it's still there. But my grandmother and her siblings kept putting off getting the Bible from Grandpa Babe. Oh yeah, next time we come down, we'll get it. And Grandpa Babe one night set the house on fire and burnt the house down. And the Bible and all the pictures and everything went up in a towering inferno. And thus, it does no longer exist. So don't wait to go and pick up that thing. Go and get it. If somebody's already told you that you can have it, make copies of it, do whatever. And because of that particular incident, that is why I started putting together a family history book for our families, because I did not want the only copy of what we had going up in the towering inferno again. I wanted there to be 20 copies all over the world of all the information, so then that way it wasn't just in one place. So I caution again, there was one. My grandmother and them just were living their lives and having fun, and just, their dad burnt the house down and the Bible went up in flames too. So, yeah.
And I so feel you on that Bible story. You're lucky to have a Bible anyway, passed down.
Right. And photos and all of those things. I mean, we take it for granted because we've got these devices that have so much on them, but this is a phone, this is a diary, it's a camera, it's all of these things wrapped up in one. And, I'm a constant proponent of print your pictures out. And it didn't dawn on me until, one of my nieces was born. I was like, why do I have no pictures of her in my house? It's because everything's on my phone. So I started being more deliberate about printing out photos of people, because again, what happens when our phones go away? And even sometimes people have gotten into the mode of sharing them on social media, but what happens when the social media sites go, right? Print them out. That you can still maintain and pass down. Question, are you finished with your family tree? I wish. You're never done. As much as we think I'm finished, Nope. You know what'll throw
Nope.
you off? A record set will come out and you, oh, I'm done with that line. No, you're not. And it'll poke holes in your theories and you'll be like, oh my gosh, are you serious? And then you have to start the process all over again. So yes, you're never done. Never done.
And I think also it builds on the story of your ancestors, which is really important to keep searching. So I want to thank Nicka for presenting for us tonight. And thank you for all of our viewers to come in and join us. And we are recording, and the recording will be available soon. And we'll also put it on Facebook. And so it could be shared, could be viewed whenever you have time. And so we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks so much for having me.